keep fighting voices in my mind that say I'm not enough. Every single lie that tells me I will never measure up. Am I more than just the sum of every high and every low? Remind me once again just who I am, because I need to know. Ooh, oh, you say I'm loved when I can't feel a thing. You say I'm strong when I think I'm weak. And you say I am held when I am falling short. And when I don't belong, oh, you say I am yours. And I believe, oh, I believe what you say of me. I believe the only thing that matters now is everything you think of me. In you I find my worth, in you I find my identity. Ooh, oh, you say I'm loved when I can't feel a thing. You say I'm strong when I think I'm weak. And you say I am held when I am falling short. When I don't belong, oh, you say I am yours. And I believe, oh, I believe what you say of me. Oh, I believe. Taking all I have and now I'm laying it at your feet. You'll have every failure, God. You'll have every victory.
Unfortunately, a condition that many people are too familiar with. Whether it is that you have personally dealt with it, or you have a friend or family member diagnosed with it, you understand that it can be an emotionally draining path to take. If you have never dealt with it, but know someone who has or is going through it, you can try to sympathize with people. But words often lack in conveying the depths of our empathy. It's really hard to say what we're feeling. But as I watched this video, it clearly depicted it without words. It said exactly what needed to be said. A group of people willing to cut and give up something that they don't have to do, but they're doing it to convey with their actions what they may not profoundly be conveyed with their words. Now, it begs the question, will the individual with cancer physically benefit from others shaving their head? And the answer is, of course, no. The individual that has cancer will not be healed because other people cut their hair for his sake. But what they have clearly portrayed is that the individual is not alone, and that they are willing to give up things in their own lives to display this reality, that he doesn't have to walk alone, that he's not alone in this journey. When I watched this video for the first time, I was a mess. I mean, I was just like bawling my eyes out. But not just because of the moment that was captured in that video, but the bigger picture that it actually displays, the bigger picture that it paints. An individual that is struggling with their health, and a group of healthy people that are willing to meet the individual in their weakness by willing to cut off something so that they could see, this individual could see, an act of empathy and of love. Now, maybe you're still not making the connection for today, so let me help you out. When was the last time that we as a church looked like this? Because we're pretty selfish people. When was the last time that a healthy church met spiritually weak people where they're at, willing to let go of whatever they need to let go of for the sake of helping others? When was the last time that you were willing to cut something out of your life so that those who are spiritually weak could actually see Jesus more clearly in you? What are you willing to give up for the sake of others seeing Jesus more visibly through your actions? And here's the thing, you could say, well, I've invited people to church. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about what are you willing to give up in your life so that Jesus could be seen more clearly in what you are doing. More often than not, we are willing to give out of our pockets, possibly out of our time, but rarely giving up of ourselves. Right? We're willing to do the first two, even though some of them are a little bit more difficult to do. We're willing to do some of those things, but as long as it doesn't mean that we have to change things in our lives. The most difficult way to give is that way. When we have to give up something. When it will alter the way that we look and appear to the world. That's a time that we're not really willing to give up. This is a really crazy cool video, but putting it in perspective, it's just plain crazy once again. It makes no sense. Why would you cut your hair if it doesn't change the circumstance? Like, what does it fix? And here's the reality. It doesn't change the circumstance, but it does change the person's perspective. Right? That's what it's doing. It's changing the perspective that they're not going through this alone, that they're in this with another body of people. Knowing that you're not alone, even if others don't experience your weakness, they choose to walk with you and share in your pain. Sometimes the most effective way for people to see Christ in our lives and our actions is by the way that we choose to give up. Not give up on them, but give up things for the sake of others. If you joined us last week, this was something that Paul talked about in chapter 8 of the first letter to the Corinthian church. And it was food sacrificed to idols. So Paul addresses the issue by saying, hey, you know what? That food, there's nothing wrong with it. You can eat it. It's meat. God created meat. But at the end of the passage, Paul says, but if that meat causes another believer to sin, I will never eat meat again as long as I live. For I don't want to cause another believer to stumble. What are you willing to cut out of your life so that another person can experience Jesus? And I'm telling you, if you're not willing to give up anything, you have to ask yourself, is that genuine faith and care for other people? Because you're only concerned about yourself. Once again, we typically say, well, it's like, I'm willing to put others first. I'm willing to let them go in front of the line. Well, those things are simple. Even people who aren't Christian can do that. You don't need Christ to let somebody cut in front of you in line. But when you give up something for the sake of another person seeing Christ and them not stumbling, that is genuine faith. And Paul's saying, if I have to cut meat sacrificed to idols out of my diet for the sake of another individual so that they don't stumble, I'm willing to do it. If that's what it takes, I'm willing to do it. Because the goal should always be to cut out anything in our lives that may cause another weak believer to stumble. What have you or are you willing to give up for the sake of others? Ask yourself that question. Sometimes it could be something as minimal as meat, even though for me that would be a pretty significant thing. It's something minimal. But what if it's more? Would you be willing to give up something that you rightfully earned and deserved for the sake of other people knowing Jesus? Would you be willing to give up something that's going to cause you maybe some discomfort? Or maybe for today's message, let me put myself in the spot. Would I be willing to work for free for Epicenter without getting paid for the sake of people in our community knowing and growing in their relationship with Jesus? I'm glad that I have everybody's undivided attention. But it's a great question. Would I be willing to give up something like that for the sake of people knowing Jesus? Right? I'm willing to cut something out of my life for the sake of another individual. It's a great question, and we're going to tackle that today because that's actually what Paul addresses in today's chapter 9. What are we willing to give up? So before diving into the chapter, though, it's important to remember some of the things that are written throughout this letter, right? We've actually talked about some of these things, and now they're going to start to play even more of a factor because some of these things have been already scattered as points throughout this letter. Remember in chapter 1, we talked about how the church is divided in factions. There's different camps, there's different groups and cliques. Some are for Peter, some are for Apollos, some are for Paul, some only Christ. Within these groups, some are not the most fond of Paul. We talked about this in chapter 4, right? Like we talked about before, his ministry resume would not have looked that impressive. Think about Paul's life. He was shipwrecked, he was imprisoned, he was persecuted. Probably not the guy that you necessarily want to have in your church. And if you do, it's probably not like this like top notch. We would rather have the clean looking pastor who has everything together in his life, and Paul's life is pretty much falling apart by the world standards. So once again, some people don't necessarily regard Paul with a sense of respect. It's kind of like, wow, that's the reason that I follow Peter, that's the reason that I follow Apollos. So now we get to chapter 9, and Paul will now address some of the personal sacrifices that he has made and things that he has given up that are rightfully his. And of course, financial support is at the heart of this. So the chapter opens up and it quickly becomes obvious that some of the issues stem from the cliques that are being formed within the church. And it's unfortunate to say this, but it's not out of the norm. I mean, churches, it's all about cliques, right? Who you're hanging out with, who you approve of, who you don't. So starting in verse 1, it says, "Am I not as free as anyone else?" Now I'm going to get through the whole letter, through this whole passage, and then we're going to come back to it because there's a lot to talk about. And I would rather just come back after we read the whole thing. Am I not as free as anyone else? Am I not an apostle? Haven't I seen Jesus our Lord with my own eyes? Right? The road to Damascus. Isn't it because of my work that you belong to the Lord? Even if others think I am not an apostle, I certainly am to you. You yourselves are proof that I am the Lord's apostle. This is my answer to those who question my authority. Don't we have the right to live in your homes and share your meals? Don't we have the right to bring a believing wife with us as the other apostles and the Lord's brothers do, and as Peter does? Or is it only Barnabas and I who have to work to support ourselves? What soldier has to pay his own expenses? What farmer plants a vineyard and doesn't have the right to eat some of its fruit? What shepherd cares for a flock of sheep and isn't allowed to drink some of the milk? Am I expressing merely a human opinion, or does the law say the same thing? For the law of Moses says you must not muzzle an ox to keep it from eating its treads out of the grain. Was God thinking only about oxen when he said this? Wasn't he actually speaking to us? Yes, it was written for us, so that the one who plows and the one who threshes the grain might both expect a share of the harvest. Since we have planted spiritual seed among you, aren't we entitled to a harvest of physical food and drink? If you support others who preach to you, shouldn't we have an even greater right to be supported? But we have never used this right. We would rather put up with anything that can be an obstacle to the good news about Christ. Don't you realize that those who work in the temple get their meals from the offerings brought to the temple, and those who serve at the altar get a share of the sacrificial offerings? In the same way, the Lord ordered that those who preach the good news should be supported by those who benefit from it. So now, verse 15, it changes. It's the same story, but now he's giving something up. Yet I have never used any of these rights, and I am not writing this to suggest that I want to start now. In fact, I would rather die than lose my right to boast about preaching without charge. There's a lot happening in that passage, right? Paul says, hey, this is what I rightfully deserve. And then at the end he says, but I would rather not get it. So there's a number of things that are important to know. For one, first of all, the church in Corinth was actually a church that Paul planted. He actually started this church. If you go to Acts chapter 18, you can learn more about Paul's trip and the time that he spent there with the people in Corinth. So this is like, in a sense, a personal spiritual investment, which is the reason that he's writing this letter, right? There's nothing more heartbreaking than when you're invested in something and all of a sudden people are steering off course. That's the reason that he's so invested and he's saying, hey, we need to fix these issues within the environment that you're creating within the church. All these things that are happening, they're not good. They're not normal. They should not be taking place. So Paul establishes this church gathering, but now his authority is even being questioned. Paul's position is being questioned, which actually presents many challenges in many areas. And he actually addresses it. Lodging, where they get to sleep. Food, sharing meals. Who they are bringing with them, like a wife, like Peter does. Or the other apostles and Peter. Working a side job. Now, here's the thing. This either sounds crazy to some of you, or it sounds crazily accurate. Because this happens within the church. Let me personalize some of the ways that this is vocalized within churches almost 2,000 years later. It happens when they hire a pastor or when they bring in somebody to share the word. For example, why should we worry about giving them food or paying for their lodging? Isn't that their responsibility? If that's God's calling on their life, shouldn't they be the ones to take care of their own responsibilities? And then the other thing is, well, they shouldn't be a burden on the church. So why are they bringing another person with them? Or the next one would be, they're a burden on the church, so they should get an extra job so that the church doesn't have to be burdened with this idea of paying them. These are ways that people vocalize their concerns even almost 2,000 years later. But the issue with the church in Corinth is that it seems like Paul experiences a different side that other people are experiencing. Other apostles and Peter seem to be able to exercise the right of being paid, of having food and lodging, of bringing somebody with them. And he says, but aren't I in the same category of being able to do that? Even if others don't think that I'm an apostle, right? It's that factions and divisions. Some saying, questioning the authority of Paul. And he's saying, even if others think that I am not an apostle, I certainly am to you. Why? Because he planted the church. He has every right. He is the one who started this. And he uses examples and he says, a farmer, a shepherd, an ox. Shouldn't they be able to live off of what they're working on or what they planted? And in the first part of the verse 12, Paul writes, if you support others who preach to you, shouldn't we have an even greater right to be supported? So the church is taking care of people. They just don't want to take care of Paul. There's another passage, to be honest, as I talked to my wife about this. I'm like, man, I wish I could have passed, the one a few weeks ago and then this one again. Because I hate talking about money. Even though the Bible talks about it, and it's something that we are called to do, it is something that I have a hard time talking about. Because I don't want to turn anybody off from hearing the gospel because of money. Or the other thing is, I don't want to feel like a burden to the church or come across as though I am trying to justify my position, my work, or getting paid. But Paul is saying that he has every right to be getting paid. He just hasn't been exercising this right. He's let it go. He uses a variety of examples, just as we talked about. And he uses the example of a farmer. Imagine if you're a farmer and you're planting crops and somebody tells you, hey, you shouldn't be eating what you planted. You'd be like, hey, I have every right to eat whatever I want. I planted this. Right? And he's saying, hey, that's from a human, rational understanding. Let's just look at it scripturally. And he goes to Deuteronomy 25:4, where he talks about the ox working in the field. The ox should be able to eat as it is working the field. And the Bible says that they have every right to do so. And you can look at other passages. 1 Timothy 17, it says that those who preach and teach are to be paid. There is something that Paul had every right to, and it was the financial support from the church that had been planted. But he chooses not to exercise this right, and he says, I am not writing this to suggest that I want to start now. I don't want to start getting money. In fact, I would rather die than lose my right to boast about preaching without charge. Now, here's the thing. You also have to look at other passages and understand that Paul was being supported by other churches. So the issue is not the money. There's just an issue with the church in Corinth. But he's saying, I would rather just not get paid than it be an issue. Right? Then he could boast about it. So then the question kind of full circle comes back. So, would I be willing to preach if I didn't get paid? Now, I am grateful for the financial blessing and support that our church has been to us. There are churches who at times will make you feel like a burden on them, like they have every right to hold anything and everything over you. You're constantly trying to justify yourself, but I'm very grateful that that has never been the case here at Epicenter. But my family and I have been continually overwhelmed by the support, not only of the governing board, but from our church body. And I thank you for that. I am very grateful for the way that you have treated my family and I. But to answer the question, would I be willing to work for Epicenter without getting paid for the sake of people in our community knowing and growing in their relationship with Jesus? And the answer is a resounding yes, of course. Now, I know that there are certain questions that people ask, and they're like, whatever, he would never do that unless, like since he's not having to go through it, of course he's saying yes. But I would rather give up my right for the benefit of those who gain from my loss. I really would. I'm fine with that. And I'm not just saying this hypothetically. I say this because it's been done. This is not something that I'm saying to toot my own horn. There's a reason that I'm going down this path. As a matter of fact, there's some things that I don't like talking about. This is kind of like a really yay God moment. But more than anything, there's a point to this. But when Epicenter first was established almost two and a half years ago, it was planted with $0 in the church bank account, with $0 in our cushion account. We had no money, my family and I. And there was no estimated timeline as to when the church might, or even if they would, be able to start paying me. But it was fine, right? And I think God has just worked so incredibly good within those 2.5 years. So I gave up any financial net that I could have had for the sake of the gospel, because I was offered a couple of other positions that may have worked out. But that's not where God was tugging us towards. And because my loss was heavily outweighed by the gain of what this church could accomplish, I was willing to take that risk, which really wasn't risk, it was faith, and not get paid. So I left a paying job, and instead of maybe finding something that would be compatible, I gave up that right. So let me just put it this way. I cut it off. All for the sake of the church. And this is not me tooting my own horn. What are you willing to cut off for the sake of others? What are you willing to abandon for the sake of others knowing Christ? And through faith and people's generosity, we kept seeing God's provision every step of the way. If you would like to see pictures of what this building looked like, I can show you. God has provided not only for that, but in so many other ways, but it was for the Epicenter to be established. I know that some of these terms may not make sense to you, but when we first filed our articles of incorporation with the state so that we could actually be recognized as a church, we had no money. I wasn't getting paid. But through generosity and through the provision of God, we were able to establish Epicenter. I wasn't going to get paid. I knew that. So I started looking for a job so that I could provide for my family. So I took a full-time position working with my father-in-law in construction, just to be able to make ends meet. And it didn't make ends meet. As a matter of fact, it was difficult because we knew that it was going to be a hard time of trying to pay bills and everything else. But once again, my loss was heavily outweighed by the gain that this church would accomplish in this community. It was hard trying to balance life, trying to figure out a time to write a message, to try to plan, to try to keep everything up to date. But I can tell you that God has been so good. I still remember the date. It was June 10th. That was the first service that we had at Epicenter. And it wasn't even here. It was at the depot. But preaching the gospel was more important than my paycheck. And we're going to go into the reason why in just a second. But June 10th was when we started. By the month of July, I was hired as a full-time lead pastor of Epicenter, getting paid. God provided. And church, God has used you in showing us his provision, his goodness, his faithfulness. But I can say that I have prayed without charge. And even though our circumstances have been changed, it doesn't diminish the fact that I would do it all over again. For the sake of seeing this. That God is moving and he is using his word to work in the lives of people. Seeing this now, I can tell you that it makes me understand that risk was worth it. Or that giving up, that cutting off was worth it. And I would do it all over again, not only because of the money, and because of you, but here's the reason why. And that's what Paul says in verses 16 through 18. Yet preaching the good news is not something I can boast about. I am compelled by God to do it. How terrible for me if I didn't preach the good news. Right? We see an example in Jonah when he refuses to take the message to the people of Nineveh. If I were doing this on my own initiative, I would deserve payment, but I have no choice. For God has given me this sacred trust. What then is my pay? It is the opportunity to preach the good news without charging anyone. That's why I never demand my rights when I preach the good news. If I can only preach when I start getting paid, maybe it's not that God has initiated my calling, but that maybe I was pursuing something under my own initiative. I can tell you with confidence that before ministry became a job, it was first my calling. It didn't start the moment that I started working at the church. There are a number of times that I have had conversations with people about the gospel, even before I started working within the church. And it wasn't because of what I received. I typically, actually most of the time, did not receive anything, but because of the opportunity, I had to share what had been entrusted to me. I did it. Church, I pray that none of this that is taking place is done under my own initiative, but that it is a response to God's calling placed in my life. Even though we have been blessed by our church for having the support, here is another thing that I love about our governing board and our church. And that is that throughout the service, as we get ready to wrap it up today, if you're part of it, you know this. If you're joining us for the first time, just kind of a little bit of a heads up. But that is that we're not going to be passing any plate around for you to give. And I don't know if this is true or not. I really hope not. But I've heard of different churches who at times pass a plate, not once, but a number of times because they didn't get the offering that they had expected the first time around. I can tell you that we're not going to do that. As a matter of fact, we'll have weeks that giving isn't very strong. We don't even meet our budget. But then there are weeks that man, God just blesses us above and beyond what we need. And we're not going to pass the plate around. As a matter of fact, we're simply at the end of the service going to tell you 2 ways that you could give if you choose to do so. That's all. And I actually want to encourage you to do or not do something. If you're here joining us for the first time today, I saw a meme and it said, that moment you invite your friend to church and the pastor talks about money. So once again, I was thinking about skipping over this chapter, but like I said, we're going to tackle every chapter. But I want to give you the ability to do something. If giving, talking about money, is going to prevent you from hearing what we have to say, from hearing the gospel, from hearing the Bible, I am telling you, please, 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 please don't give. Like seriously, just walk out the door. We're okay with that because we don't want it to be a burden. It's not about the money. As a church, we would rather have the opportunity to preach the good news without ever coming across like we're charging anybody to hear it. I don't care if it's standing in front of the stage or if it's standing at the meat aisle at Walmart. I will preach about Jesus, and I have, because it is my hope. It's my living hope. It's everything that I have, and it doesn't have to be on this stage. Maybe I've had a conversation with you at Walmart, at the hospital, at the street. Maybe it's been when I've been just like getting coffee. I don't know. Wherever it's been, I'm telling you, I don't do it because I feel like I need to, because it's my job. It is because it is my calling. It's all of our callings to share the good news. I don't want anything to ever get in the way of people hearing the gospel. So I'm telling you, if you're here today, don't give. I would rather lay down my right of being financially supported than not do what I am being called to do. I would rather live like a slave that has no rights for the sake of the gospel, which is what Paul continues in saying in verse 19. Even though I am free with no master, and he's talking about earthly master, I have become a slave to all people to bring many to Christ. When I was with the Jews, I lived like a Jew to bring the Jews to Christ. When I was with those who follow the Jewish law, I too lived under the law. Even though I am not subject to the law, I did this so I could bring to Christ those who are under the law. When I am with the Gentiles who do not follow the Jewish law, I too live apart from that law so I can bring them to Christ. But I do not ignore the law of God. I obey the law of Christ. When I am with those who are weak, I share their weakness, for I want to bring the weak to Christ. Yes, I try to find common ground with everyone, doing everything I can to save some. I do everything to spread the good news and to share in its blessing. Church, I would rather give up my rights in many areas for the sake of people hearing the truth that can change the trajectory and the course of their life. I would rather look, once again, like the people in the intro video, cutting their hair, becoming all things to all people for the sake of some of them being saved, so that they could see the power of Christ working within me. This is a passage that at times it can be stretched so poorly. And at times we think about this, that we're willing to do absolutely anything, even compromise, for the sake of saving some. Sometimes it's stretched really poorly. But here's the thing. I am willing to give up anything, becoming all things to all people, to prevent them from stumbling. I am willing to become weak for the sake of the weak so that they could see Christ in me. I am willing to try to find common ground with anyone for the sake of them hearing the gospel of Jesus so that they could be saved. And at times we think, well, that means that I should do the things that they're doing. No. Not if it's going to harm your witness. Let me go back to the passage, because at times we put ourselves in risky situations and we defend ourselves by saying what Paul stated, right? Becoming all things to all people. Verse 21, Paul states, I did not ignore the law of God. I obey the law of Christ. He's not ignoring what is true. He's just simply becoming all things to people so that they could hear the gospel. And as stated throughout this letter, as we talked about in the week prior, loving your neighbor doesn't mean that you're going to lead them astray. It means that you're willing to give up things so that they don't go astray, to prevent them from stumbling. Church, becoming all things to all people is not about the things that we should engage in that violate God's law. At no point should we compromise our faith while risking leading others astray. I don't care how you try to defend this. You engaging in sinful behavior is not okay. Let me give you an example. Working with teens, this is like a top-notch excuse. Well, I'm going to the party, they're drinking and they're doing all these other things, probably shouldn't be doing it, but I'm going so that hopefully they can hear about Jesus. Give me a break. Are you really going to talk about Jesus? No, you're going to put yourself in a risky situation that is ultimately going to lead you to sin. Becoming all things to all people, and they will say, well, Jesus did it. Yeah, but he didn't engage in the behavior. He changed the environment. There are things that we can lay down and cut away from our lives that will benefit the faith of others, but then we can also get to the point that they aren't beneficial for us. As a matter of fact, they are harmful, and they're going to weigh us down. In a desire to share Jesus, we try to become all things to all people, abandoning what we know to be true while defending our stance with partial revelation. So we use like this partial verse, and we don't really follow it all the way through. This week, my wife and I were actually having a conversation about this kind of idea, the things that we're willing to abandon. But we talked about a couple of bracelets that have actually made their rounds in our culture. The first one is no longer trending. It was trending when I was younger. But the bracelet had the acronym WWJD. What would Jesus do? If you know what that is, you probably are my age or older, and you probably actually even have one. But the acronym, once again, stood for what would Jesus do? Great question, right? As you're standing in the corner and there's a person asking for money, or when there is a person in need, look at the bracelet, what would Jesus do? Of course he would respond. But then there was also the other aspect, as you're getting ready to sin and you're thinking about doing something that you shouldn't. I know that was the case with me, but I would see that bracelet and there would be that conviction. It's like, well, Jesus definitely would not do what I'm doing. But I love that bracelet. Since then, though, there's been a second bracelet that has come out in response to that first bracelet. And the acronym is a little bit weirder. I actually had to look at it to make sure that I'm saying it right. HWLF. Quite frankly, when I first saw it, I'm like, who puts that in their hand? Then I realized that it was a response to that first WWJD. So what would Jesus do? This second bracelet was a response, and it was, he would love first. Two great acronyms that can help us in navigating life as believers. Now, with that being said, I have some reservations towards the newest bracelet. And if you have one, please understand, I'm not saying that it's junk or that it shouldn't be taken, or that it shouldn't be used. I'm not saying for you to get rid of it, far from it. I completely agree. It's accurate. Jesus will love the sinner first. We actually see it in him coming in human form to die for us. We see the love of God. But I believe that we have gotten so caught up in the cultural idea of love, that we have lost sense of Jesus' response to sin in the lives of those that he has demonstrated love to. We have forgotten to ask the question, what would Jesus do in this scenario? We just simply love everything. Not biblically, culturally. I'm just going to accept, I'm going to tolerate, I'm not going to say anything because I don't want to offend anyone. That's not biblical. That's far from biblical. Becoming all things to all people means that sometimes you have to ask the question, what would Jesus do in this circumstance? In the midst of becoming all things to all people and demonstrating the love of Christ, don't ignore living in light of what makes you different and gives you hope. Otherwise, you have nothing to offer. Find common ground and love people, but don't forget to ask the way that Jesus would respond in the midst of a situation where you're trying to love people biblically. Don't act carelessly. Put others before you. And I encourage you, I want to wrap it up with the final verses of the chapter 9. But Paul puts it in perspective, right? This life's a journey. We're just going through this life almost like a race. And he says, don't you realize that in a race, everyone runs, but only one person gets a prize. So run to win. A friend of mine from church actually shared this with me. He's like, really think about it. In the rule book for running a race, a marathon, whatever you want to call it, there's no rule against you actually putting like ankle weights on. But it would be ridiculous to do so, right? Because you're slowing yourself down. Don't you realize that in a race, everyone runs? You're running, you're competing. Don't put anything on you that is going to slow you down. But only one person gets a prize. So run to win. All athletes are disciplined in their training. They do it to win a prize that will fade away, but we do it for an eternal prize. So I run with purpose in every step. I am not just shadow boxing, I'm not just training. I discipline my body like an athlete, training it to do what it should. Otherwise, I fear that after preaching to others, I myself might be disqualified. Focus on the prize. And in everything that you do or that you don't do it for the purpose of winning. An athlete, if you know an athlete, understand how they live. They actually do everything that will benefit their condition for the race. They go and, to the track and they practice, they run. If you've seen athletes, wrestlers, so forth and so on, they watch what they eat. What? For the purpose of the competition. Watch what you're eating. I'm talking about, food sacrifice titles. I love deep fried food, so I'm trying to make an excuse right there. But, if you have ever been around an athlete, once again, there will be some things that they're not going to participate in. Having many athletes within our youth group, there are some games that they just won't participate in. Why? For fear of getting hurt and ultimately being disqualified from winning. Paul's saying, treat your life like you're in a race. The reason why you should be cautious is because your goal should be to win the prize. So run as you're training to win that prize. An eternal prize that won't fade away. So live with purpose and abandon self for the sake of others and for the sake of that prize. So I'm telling you once again, if there's anything that's going to prevent you from hearing this message, and if it's giving, don't give. I would rather not have the support and do what I am being called to do. But at the same time, I encourage you, also live that way yourself. Be willing to give whatever it takes for the sake of others seeing Christ in you. Let's pray.